This episode may contain content of a graphic nature. Listener discretion is advised.
Thanks for joining us today on another episode of Body to Burial. I'm Mariah.
And I'm Nikki.
We're just two regular true crime junkies who decided it was time to see crime from a new perspective. This is Body to Burial. All right, so today we've got a real sciencey one, and I'm excited. I think there's like a lot of stuff that we think we know about it that we don't really understand. I think this is like one of the ones that, like, based on television, like, you think that it's like a very easy, quick, and dirty process. And I feel like it's going to be way more complicated, obviously, because it's real life, not television. But we are talking to Tiffany, who is a forensic DNA expert.
What's that? Like, because I'm thinking about Jamie, where we were talking about, let me think, hold on, my brain, where we asked him a question about if you can tell whose blood's whose. So is that kind of, is that what it is? Like where she could tell if it's my blood or your blood?
Again, I think, historically, I'm usually incorrect when I assume what I think they do. But yeah, in Mariah's brain, that's what she does. Like, I think that they work to retrieve DNA from like blood stains, saliva, skin cells, hair, and then try to find a match.
Okay.
Again, we'll get Tiffany to clarify that within the first 30 seconds because I'm usually wrong, but I think that that's what it is. So I think they come to the crime scene, they get the blood samples, maybe like the skin cells under the fingernails or whatever, and try to see if they have a hit.
I'm dying to know about genealogy because I love that stuff.
Yes.
You can be connected to people. I want to see how they can they do that, or is it going to go in that direction with database for crimes?
Yeah, see, I don't know, because okay, so one, there's the database, but you're only in the database if you committed a crime. So I wonder if it's the same thing for Tiffany. Like, do they only have access to samples or DNA profiles of people that are already in the system? I'm assuming yes. Again, I don't know.
I want to ask her this. If I committed a crime, but I wasn't caught, and then my cousin was in the system and they can link her to me. I wonder if that's how it works.
We're going to have to ask her because I think that there is some broad strokes terminology when it comes to we have a match on a profile. I think that potentially based on race or ethnicity, you could get a hit, but it's not necessarily Nikki. Again, I'm probably not making a lot of sense and I'm literally talking out of my pretend job. I think that we need her to define to us what it means when they say they have a match, because I don't think that always necessarily means they found the bad guy. Well, let me get Tiffany on and let's get rolling and let's go to school. Let's get our forensic DNA on today.
Here we go.
Hello?
Hey, Tiffany, it's Mariah.
Hi, I knew it was you.
So an easy way that we kind of lead into it is we always ask people to explain what you do in 1 to 2 sentences.
So now I examine evidence that is processed primarily by government labs or private laboratories that the government intends to use in a criminal proceeding, just to make sure everything has been done correctly.
Okay. So I guess in broad strokes, your profile, you're a DNA expert. What does that mean? Nikki and I were talking about that, and I historically usually get everybody's occupation wrong. I told Nikki, I assume it's where you guys are extracting DNA from bloodstains or bone marrow, saliva, skin cells, hair, that sort of thing.
Yes. So I started my career in a crime lab working for a government agency, and we would test evidence to develop DNA profiles, and we would make comparisons to those profiles, for people of interest,
Hmm.
write reports about our findings and testify to those findings in court. And so I did actual testing work in the early part of my career, what I would say probably the first half, the first seven and a half to 8 years, or testimony and review of the work that's being done at the labs.
Okay. So we definitely have a lot of questions. I
Okay.
think our first question that Nikki and I both were really curious about is DNA testing as specific as like a fingerprint analyst? Like, how exact is it? Because from what I understand, like when you quote unquote get a match, there could be like race or ethnicity that occurs to match it, but it may not be like a direct match to, like, let's say if Nikki committed a crime. Does that make any sense, or am I making no sense at all?
It does. So I'll explain it. I'm going to explain it in a way that makes sense to me, but you know, the common conception of forensic DNA is that people think it's the gold standard. So we think
Yeah.
about it in very absolute terms, like fingerprints. And I think that maybe the origins of forensics and the need for them as an applied science to solve crime sort of lent themselves to some statements like that, like matches that are absolute
Hmm.
and very specific. And I think as a community, forensic science is trying to move away from that kind of language because we realize that not all fingerprints and not all DNA profiles are created equal. So we have sometimes very clear and very specific information that we're able to obtain. And I would liken this to a cheek swab from the inside of someone's cheek or a blood stain from a crime scene that's single source. And so we can see there's a lot of very clear information. There's a lot of very specific information. Um, and that's really what I consider to be the gold standard. That single source DNA profile match to single source DNA profile match is very informative. And it tells us a great deal about the genetic information that's there and
Hmm.
about people who could have left that information behind. But we also get poor quality fingerprints and we get poor quality DNA profiles that are less informative. So when a DNA profile is mixed, when we test steering wheels from rental cars or from door handles where many, many people have touched those surfaces and left
Hmm.
behind just a little bit of themselves at a time, um, that information is much less clear and it's much less specific and it's much harder to interpret. So just like a smudgy print or a very partial fingerprint, there might be some information there, but maybe not enough information to describe with specificity an individual person who could have left that behind. And I think about this in terms of physical eyewitness descriptions of perpetrators. Sometimes you could get very clear information from someone who is paying very close attention, and you could get many, many traits: hair color, eye color, height, weight, skin color, maybe unique markings or tattoos. It depends on, the more information with more specificity, the better off a physical profile will be, and the more likely it will be that you could describe a perpetrator to the exclusion of all other people. And DNA profiles are like that. The single source DNA profile is like, a 15-point physical description of a person with a lot of clear information. But then we get some DNA profiles that are very muddled and they're not very informative. So it's like a physical eyewitness description of 6 foot tall black male.
Sure.
That's never going to describe someone to the exclusion of all other individuals. And it's not informative. It's not very informative. So really DNA profiles exist on this sliding scale. You get some very good and clear information that's very informative. And then you get some that are not very informative and there's a lot of gray area and they're difficult to interpret. So that's where the problems arise when we have, not the ideal profiles, when we have
Hmm.
mixed profiles or partial profiles. And just in general, even with the most clear information, I think now as a science, and in science, we try not to use absolute language. We always leave open the possibility, however small, that the information we have could randomly match some untested person somewhere. So we really try hard not to say, this is this person's DNA. We say there's a lot of consistency. There's so many consistencies, over the course of this profile, that the chance we would expect somebody to also have all of these traits is very slim, very, very small. But we still acknowledge that possibility exists because we've not tested every person on the planet, and people are born every day and people die every day. And we realize that our knowledge as scientists does update. And so we try not to speak in those absolute terms.
So you have someone in custody. Can it be absolute if you match it to the sample that you have?
We try not to. We say the profiles match over this many traits. Usually right now we're working 21, right? So what are the chances that someone would have all 21 of these traits that we observed in this evidence profile? It's very small. It's infinitesimally small in some cases. We don't expect that will happen, but we don't rule out that possibility. We just try to give that information to the people who are going to use it. We say, the information matches. The chance of a random match is very, very small. But, we don't ever say this DNA came from this individual.
Oh, okay.
We try not to. There are still some laboratories that do that. But I think as a science, even fingerprints, we're trying to move away from using that kind of language, and we're trying to just provide the science, the data, along with the mathematical estimation of how common or rare this event would be if we expected it randomly just by bad luck.
Man, it is very math and science. That's crazy.
Yeah. We're trying to find an objective way to weight this, right? We don't want people to say, based on my training and experience as an expert, I think this DNA profile came from this person, because everybody has a differing background. People have differing skills. People have different biases. So we're trying to find an objective way to estimate this that kind of removes the human element, and is kind of transparent in a way that we can show people how we arrived at this weight. And it's not intrinsic just to me. It's not intrinsic to the person who's doing the analysis.
I guess I'm just trying to simplify this in my brain a little bit. So you have I think, did you call it first degree testing, where it would be you have the suspect and then you have the sample from the crime scene or wherever, and then you can build a profile based on a saliva swab versus what was collected at the crime scene. But what happens if you don't have a suspect in hand? How do you guys build a profile from just evidence alone? Is there a database that you then take your information and run it against to see if there's matches?
Yeah. So it has to be the kind of information that's very clear, or clear enough that we can put it into a database and it won't return 100 million random hits. The testing essentially doesn't change whether we have some suspect that's listed or if it doesn't. We proceed with the testing process in the exact same way. So we would just go and test it in the laboratory. The only difference is at the end, we'll have something to compare it to and say whether we think this is an inclusion or an exclusion, if we have a standard to compare. And if we don't, when we reach the end, if we have a suitable profile, we have the option, if you're working for a government laboratory that is accredited and meets the standards that have been set forth by the FBI, then you can upload those profiles into the CODIS database. So CODIS stands for Combined DNA Indexing System, and it contains DNA profiles from crime scenes and from unidentified remains and from evidence that's been collected from crime scenes but has not been attributed to a perpetrator.
Okay. Nikki, you should ask Tiffany about the question that you were talking about, if you committed a crime,
ancestry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, because I was wondering, because I do that. I love that ancestry, and I did because my grandma had a her dad. She had no clue who he was, and so it's been a mystery. So we did the DNA, ancestry thing, and it linked us to a family member who then it turned out that was like her uncle. And then blah, blah, blah. She gave us the whole story about, who he was and this and that just through doing that ancestry DNA thing. And then, so is there like, say I committed a crime. No one knew it was me, but my cousin's in jail and her stuff is in the database. Could you link that to me somehow or no?
So there are people who can do that now. I don't think they have access to Ancestry unless they come with a search warrant to search that database. But there are other genealogy databases that some experts are now searching and finding perpetrators of crimes through the DNA of their relatives that have been uploaded into those databases. So pretty controversial because I think that there were a lot of people that did that kind of testing and did not anticipate that their DNA would be used for that. And now they estimate that essentially every Caucasian on the planet is now databased. Essentially, we can find people from, their third or fourth cousins, and they estimate that nearly every Caucasian person has someone in that database that would allow them to be accessible to law enforcement through those searches now.
I find it really interesting because just how DNA matches you. I mean, it wasn't a crime situation, obviously. We were just trying to figure out who this guy was from 1916. But it's like really interesting how it works on a personal level. And I would assume that like people don't like Ancestry where all of a sudden they had a kid that they had no clue about and then they pop up,
Well, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting conversation to have given some of the legal developments in this country. And I wonder how people would feel knowing now that some people are going to be using these databases to assign parentage for the purposes of payments for child custody and child support. And, I think they're using them also in places right now. I think they're using it in like Thailand and places where there's a lot of humanitarian work, where the people go in and they, under the guise of, humanitarian assistance, and they make these women and children pregnant, and then they leave and go back to wherever they're from. They're trying to use the DNA, through the genealogy to be able to track these people down that have committed these kind of crimes. So
that's wild.
Yeah, it has far-reaching implications, and it's kind of a really interesting and exciting time to watch it as a lawyer and a scientist. But also, you really understand that we have no idea how this is going to be used. And, there's all of these other uses that are just now starting to present themselves that maybe not everybody is going to be as happy about, catching murderers and rapists. We can all sort of get behind that. But when they start knocking on the doors for child support payments, for this one night stand that you had at your business conference, I don't think people are going to feel the same about it.
Yeah, because that's what I was wondering. Like, and I know that there's like the HIPAAs and all those like things, but I was telling Mariah, I'm like, I don't understand that. Like, so you've committed a crime, like a horrible crime, big or small, but to the person that it happened to is going to be big, and it doesn't matter if it's a small thing, I think. And say your DNA is out there or something, and because you can't access it because of privacy. It's so crazy to me. Like, I don't get it. To me, I don't understand it, but
it's a lot. It's a lot. And I mean, just the idea. So, I mean, it sounds like you will have children and I have children, and essentially like this, now our children are database. If my 5-year-old son decides to turn to a life of crime, even if it's petty crime, he's in a database because of my uncle who tested his DNA and put it up into Ancestry. And you just wonder how, where this is going to go. They're buying and selling these databases. The Ancestry.com database, I mean, it's huge. And it's a reputable company. The people, they have lawyers there that try to protect that information. But essentially, that's a company that can be acquired. And with the DNA, database that it owns is a commodity. And you wonder, how that's going to be used in the future and, what protections are in place. There's very little law. There's very little oversight for this because I think it's just so new.
Yeah.
So it's definitely an interesting time to be in this field for sure.
Could they ever get it wrong? Like say my cousin committed a crime and then they thought it was me because I'm in this like database. Could they get it wrong?
There has been at least one instance of that. And I want to try to, I would have to Google it to find out the name of the individual that they identified. Part of this is that we're working, so it's a genealogist who's doing these searches on the biology side and the DNA side, but then they're handing off some of that information to law enforcement. And what law enforcement does with it is completely out of control of the genealogist. So once they get a name and they start looking into it, it might be premature. And that has happened. Let me see if I can find the name. I might have to look that up after we get off the phone and send it to you. But
Perfect.
There has been at least one person that was arrested wrongfully, and they eventually came to the right person. But I think what it seemed like was maybe that law enforcement jumped the gun and arrested someone before they were able to do a regular comparison of this person's DNA to the crime scene. They covered it in 48 hours because this was one of the, I think, people's fears. A common misconception is that, we could have people that are suspected for crimes, from genealogy, especially if you have people that are unskilled genealogists and they don't know, because a lot of these genealogists are self-taught.
Yeah.
We don't have college programs for this kind of thing, or we're starting to have them now for the forensic aspect, but a lot of these people, learned about genealogy in the same way that you learned about the searches. They studied their own family because there was a misidentification of parentage somewhere, and they needed to locate relatives and sort of solve their own family puzzle. And then once they had done that, they had exposure to it, and they know how to search through these things, the records and the databases, to identify people they could be related to.
How new is this? Like, how new is this whole DNA thing?
So using the genealogy databases for crime purposes, this really started happening, I think, in 2018. So it's actually very new.
Yeah.
I think people recognize that it could be used for this. I think there was a period of time where people were wondering if they should be using it for law enforcement purposes.
Mm-hmm.
One of the more well-known groups that sort of does this kind of genealogy searching, they're called the DNA Doe Project. And so they have limited their searches to unidentified remains and tracking them down and giving them their name back. So I think if people think that they're drug addicts or they're prostitutes, I do think there is some bias in law enforcement and in some areas of forensics where they don't maybe put as many resources into identification of those kind of people.
Yeah.
So they are kind of like the forgotten. And this group really focuses on, giving names to these people.
I like that.
And yeah, I think it's really, it's good work, and it's humble work. There's a lot of weird jockeying right now in forensic genealogy for, who can solve the biggest case and who can get the most PR and who was the pioneer of this. And the people who are doing the DNA Doe stuff are really not trying to do that. They're just steadfastly working to identify, all of these forgotten people. And I think it's really humble, really good work.
Yeah. Yeah, that's neat. What about, I have this just popped into my head. What about twins, like identical twins? Do they have the same DNA?
Identical twins, for the purposes of standard DNA testing, they do, but with the technology that we use to develop the profiles they use for genealogy, those are slightly different. So it's actual sequencing. So they're sequencing the genome, certain parts of it. And I know that there have been people, and there's labs that specialize in sequencing until they find a difference in an identical twin. So over time, your DNA is changing and it's mutating. So even though the DNA of the identical twins when they're born is exactly the same, if you would sequence them later on in life, you might find some differences.
Oh, wow.
That has come up. There have been some cases where that has come up, where that's been important. There was one very famous one in Boston where one identical twin was accused of a rape crime, and he pointed his finger at his twin brother. And so they needed to go to a laboratory in Europe that specialized in sequencing testing to try to find a difference between the crime scene sample and one of the brothers.
That's interesting how, because I thought that you're identical and everything's identical, like I didn't know that your DNA can change over time.
Certain parts, the parts that we focus on for forensic purposes are parts that stay consistent over a long period of time, but there are some rapidly mutating parts. We just don't use those. We want the ones that are going to stay the same over time.
Oh, okay.
So I was wondering, what is the best way of retrieving a DNA sample? Like in terms of blood or saliva or hair, semen, do they all produce the same information, or is there one that's preferred over another?
They all produce the same information. For the testing that we do in the crime lab, we expect you to have the same DNA in all of those different sources. And the only difference is just the ease in collection. So we usually do a cheek swab now because we can get those skin cells off of the inside of the cheek pretty easy. It's pretty non-invasive, and it still has a high quantity of DNA. Blood has a lot of DNA in it. It comes from the white blood cells that are part of your blood. Semen is very rich in DNA, but because all of those cells are going to have the exact same DNA profile, it's just easier for us to obtain usually a cheek swab.
And this is like a random question, but I've seen this on like a ton of true crime forums. So I'm going to ask it just so that we can get clarity on this one. But the question that I've always seen out there is kind of like, if you have hair and you donate it to Locks of Love and the recipient of the hair commits a crime and leaves hair at the crime scene, your DNA is now at that crime scene and you could be potentially connected?
Well, no, I mean, and the short answer to that is, one thing that you should know about the DNA typing that we do, when we test hairs, it's usually from the little skin cell tag that's from the root of the hair. So we usually don't get DNA from the shaft of the hair. There is some technology that can test that. Mitochondrial DNA testing, we can test on the shaft of the hair, but that's not specific from person to person. So you have the same mitochondrial DNA profile as your mother and all your maternal relatives. So so the more specific information, the gold standard stuff would come from the skin cells that are attached at the end, the follicular tag. And then if it doesn't have that, we could go on and do mitochondrial testing. There are some types of testing that are being used now on shafts of hair. But just in general, anyone can do that with anything, not just your hair, right? Somebody could wear your ball cap. Somebody could wear your shoes. Somebody could wear your t-shirt and leave it behind at a crime scene. And that could implicate you. And we have to understand this as experts. We know that DNA transfers onto things, and that's why it has value for us in an investigation. But we also have to acknowledge that a person's DNA can get to a location without that person ever having been there. And, it can be on an article of clothing that somebody brings to the crime scene. Yeah. We really have to assess the value of that information every time. Does this prove that the person committed the crime that's being alleged? And that's what I would say to any jury is that, DNA alone, your DNA at a crime scene is never going to be enough. There needs to be other supporting evidence. And if everybody has done their job, they will find those links. Someone should find those links. But if they can't, your DNA at a crime scene alone is not enough to show that you committed a crime. And that oftentimes in many cases is all people have. But because DNA is regarded as such strong evidence, it's very persuasive, and a lot of convictions result from that. But me as an expert, I know that those things can happen. Someone could wear your Locks of Love ponytail, or someone could wear your hat, or someone could wear your flip-flops, and that could look very bad for you.
What if there's a lot of your blood at the scene and not just like a little drop? What if there's like a lot?
I mean, it really just depends on every case is different. Every scenario is different, but there might be an explanation in the context of that case of why your blood might be in that location. Is it your own home? I there's at least one person that bleeds in this house a week. My kids, myself. I think about women in their own home, and we menstruate.
Yep.
There's just
Yep.
you have to really think critically and say, in the context of this case, is this important information, or could this be just looking bad on its surface? And really, it's just from everyday living in that location or driving that vehicle. I mean, a lot of somebody's blood in the trunk of a car is going to be pretty powerful, but a lot of somebody's blood in their own, like on their own mattress, you really got to think, is how much is a lot,
Well, I was
subjective.
thinking I was like thinking OJ, like remember the OJ case where it was like on the sidewalk. And now I'm thinking in my head, I know it was her blood, but I don't know if he had any blood there.
Yeah, there was some of his blood at the scene, I believe. And I
But then
have
how
to
do
go
you
back.
explain that? Like, he's not, because it wasn't his home. It's out in front.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. In the context of that case, it might be very powerful. But, that's why every single case you have to kind of look and you have to ask these questions. And it's
Yeah.
really hard. The attorneys have to bring these points up and make them clear. And it's very difficult for them sometimes to do that. They sometimes see DNA and they're like, oh no, it's over. This is the nail in the coffin. But no, you have to put it in context and you have to really examine, could this be from some innocent day-to-day activity, or is this indicative of some crime?
Yeah.
That has to be addressed in every single case because every case is different.
How do you separate, like, what happens if there's a lot of blood from both people, the victim and the criminal? Can you tell and separate the two? If it's just like a pool of it all together, can you tell whose is who?
No, a lot of times we can't. We would say that they couldn't be excluded. I have heard one of my colleagues explain this really well, and then they use a smoothie metaphor. So if you put strawberries and blueberries into the blender and you hit the blend, you wouldn't really be able to tell which parts were strawberry and which parts were blueberry, but you can tell when you taste it that maybe there's strawberries in there, there's blueberries in there, but you're not going to be able to separate them.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what DNA is like once it gets mixed up like that. We can say that they can't be excluded, but we can't say which parts come from which person. Sometimes we can based on the amounts. If there's a whole lot of strawberry and only a few blueberries, we might be able to say, oh yeah, definitely strawberry in here. Because it stands out above anything else. But, sometimes it's an even mix and it's just like hitting the blend on the smoothie.
That's a really good analogy.
A lot of the crime shows cause a lot of, I guess, false information that the general public believes about these professions. What do you think is the biggest misconception with DNA analysts?
So I think that the biggest misconception is sort of the thing we talked about, the sliding scale, is that DNA is just widely regarded as very strong all the time. And sometimes it's not very strong, and sometimes it's not very informative. And I think it's harder to make that clear in court because attorneys want to use these results in a way that supports their narrative and supports their ethical obligation and the story that they're trying to tell. And they're not necessarily concerned with making sure the evidence is fully understood in its most accurate light. So I think that all DNA is just widely regarded as very strong evidence, the nail in the coffin, and that's not what it is. And then also contextually, right? How that DNA got there, that needs to be considered every time. Is there an innocent explanation for this? Is the presence of this person's DNA at the crime scene indicative of some misdeed? Or could there be an innocent explanation and this just really looks bad? And we know that DNA can transfer on items of clothing. We know people can transfer DNA from other people onto other items. So we really just have to be very careful with the information and the inferences we're drawing from the presence or absence of a person's DNA at a crime scene.
And how long does it take? Like, let's say you swab my cheek. How long does it take for you to get
like my profile markers back?
We have rapid instrumentation now that can get a profile from a cheek swab in about 35 minutes. But the type of full testing that we do in the crime lab, it usually takes, I would say, a full day to do it. If you start in the morning, you could be finished by the end of the day. There are some parts that take several hours, 2 or 3 hours. It's possible to do it and turn it around in one day, but it's a concerted effort. And then everything we do, all the results need to be reviewed then by another qualified analyst. So someone else to come through all of the documentation, all the notes, and make sure that all the procedures were followed and that we got results where we should have got results and all of our controls passed. So there's a stringent review process that takes place once the testing process is complete.
Have you had any memorable cases that you've helped solve?
One that stands out to me, I did testing on a cold case. It was a Florida case, and it was an old woman who someone broke in and beat her to death. Yeah, and it was hair that was in her hand. And we tested it 30 years later, and the DNA profile from the follicular tag on the hair hit in the database to a person.
Now, was he already in jail?
He had a criminal history. I don't know if he was already in jail, but the victim's name, I'll never forget her name. Her name was Bertha Hemminghoff.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, after the trial, her granddaughter sent me a message on LinkedIn to thank me for my work, which is always a strange thing, but, you don't realize the impact that you have on people doing this work, because I can't say, I don't have any information about whether that person committed the crime or they didn't. And I don't know what all the other evidence looked like, but, going into it, you realize that you're part of a big system that does have significant impact on people.
Yeah, that's fantastic, because that had to be, I need conclusions. So if I was left hanging for 30 years, just that sense of relief of finally knowing at least there's who this person was and there's an ending. That's fantastic that you can give that to cold cases and to people.
Well, I don't really, so I would say it's not my job. I didn't do that, right? It had to be a skilled investigator. And the investigators who worked on this case were some of the best investigators I've ever had the pleasure to work with in my entire life. But they had to go back to the evidence. And someone had to have the fortitude to preserve these hairs and label them properly. And someone had to make sure they were stored properly over time. And then these investigators went back to these old files and said, oh, we've got these hairs now. We can test these for DNA. So really, it was a skilled investigator. I gave them some data. I gave them a piece of information. But, investigators solve crime. Investigators play a central role in achieving justice for victims, and the prosecutors do as well. And that's not really what I do, but you
have a part.
You just do your small part and try to just realize that I don't know the truth of what happened, but what information I can provide, I try to do it, as best I can do.
I wish they had blood preserved from Jack the Ripper so we can solve that mystery.
I know there's been so much speculation. I think there was something else too. Someone claimed a few months ago, or the beginning part of the latter part of last year, where they claimed again to have identified him.
Oh, really?
And there's a lot of cases. I wish that we could get closure for John Benet Ramsey, through DNA. And there's just some cases where you just wish, you could get the answers, and Madeleine McCann, but these are things that we recognize you don't have DNA and you don't have evidence really in every single case. So,
that's frustrating.
Only so much. Yeah, there's only so much the scientists can do. The investigators really have to put you in a position to give them information.
Yeah. And then how long can that, that was preserved for 30 years. How long could that potentially stay preserved for if it's properly preserved?
I think indefinitely. I think if it's properly preserved, I've known people in cases that have been 40 years old. And we test DNA from dinosaurs.
Oh, yeah, true. Yeah.
Yeah, like really ancient remains and the Romanovs. And so I think, if it's stored properly, then there'll be some type of testing that we can perform on it indefinitely.
So in a fossil, going back to dinosaurs, I think it's so crazy that you can test fossils and stuff. So there's a little part of DNA within that fossil that you can test to get information?
Well, there's DNA in our bones and any biological material there will be. It just depends on the different types of testing and how sensitive it is, and whether it's designed for ancient DNA, something like that that's very old.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there's always the chance that it's so degraded and so far gone and too old that you won't get a sample. That's always a possibility. But
yeah,
if things are preserved correctly, then it increases the chance that you can get something. And our technology is advancing all the time. We have completely different tech than we had 10 years ago, and we're more sensitive. We can get DNA from just even fractions of skin cells. Some of the testing that just a few skin cells, and we can get a standard DNA profile at the crime lab. So we're very, very sensitive. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, right? Because then you have to ask yourself, does this really play a role, or did somebody just walk by and slough off some skin cells? And now here we are trying to track them down. But the technology is advancing all the time.
And you can tell, I just say at a scene, there's also animal, dog, cat, whatever blood. You can tell the difference between human blood and animal blood. What's the difference between that?
Yeah, they're completely different. So they're structured different. So the DNA, there is DNA testing for those, and we call them serological tests. So we could perform a test to determine what type of animal the blood is from, and say whether it's dog blood or cat blood, things like that. But the kind of forensic testing that we do in the crime lab, it won't work on anything that's not human or higher primate.
Oh, okay.
So if it's dog blood, we just won't get a DNA profile, or if it's, some other kind of animal.
What's a higher primate?
Gorilla. I'm not exactly sure how far down the
Were you thinking aliens, Nikki?
Cloning? I don't know. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I was thinking like gorillas or monkey or something. Like I was thinking that.
Yeah, we have enough similarity to some primates that we would expect some information to be typed if we tried it on them.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So no aliens yet.
No aliens. Not that I know of. I don't know what goes on out there at area, what is that area that we've got out there?
Area 51, is that it, Nikki?
I was going to say 54. So.
I know, that's the studio. I didn't want to be the one to make that up.
But I'm sure there's a lot of DNA floating around in there, though, too.
Yeah, there's probably a lot. Yeah, I was going to say Area 54, but it's Studio 54. So yes. My knowledge of aliens are not that great. So
to kind of flip on us and have you talk a little bit about what happens when it goes to court, because I feel like DNA appears to be like widely accepted. It's like a definitive in the public eye. So how do you present that in a way that isn't going to be, biased? Like, I feel like it would be difficult to manage the jury and making sure that they understand the science, because it really does seem complicated.
It is. And I think this is it's one of the areas that's ripe for bias, right? Every human has got some kind of bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious, because of their own lived experience. There's no way we can look at anything really objectively and not through the lens of our own experience. And so communication is a really personal thing. The words that you're choosing to describe this and the light that you cast it in, it's extremely important in court. And it's a very difficult area to try to control and regulate, because we never know going into court what a lawyer is going to ask us, what questions are going to be posed. And so I think it takes a concerted effort. And I see in testimony that oftentimes forensic DNA analysts are perfectly fine with the evidence being presented in the strongest light and in the most certain terms, because they don't get as much challenge or as much pushback. And, the prosecutors sort of like it that way. And it's really something that I wish that more DNA experts would try to resist and try to present it with its strengths and its limitations, so that we won't have miscarriages of justice based on some misconception in the presentation of the evidence in court. It's my primary focus, reporting and testimony and trying to get some kind of control measures in place to try to prevent people from skewing how the evidence is described in court and received by a jury.
Do you have to go to court a lot?
So I haven't in the last couple of years, but it's ramping up very quickly. So a lot of what I do is listening to experts and how they describe the evidence and making sure they don't describe it inaccurately. They don't overstate it. And so you really can only do that if you're there and they can see you and they know. The thing about expertise is that in a courtroom, oftentimes the DNA expert knows that they know more about their subject matter field than anyone else sitting in the room. And it emboldens people to say things for a lot of different reasons, but they know that no one can call that out unless there's another expert in the room. And so I think that's a really, really super important thing for lawyers to know, is that you got to make sure that these experts are staying in their lane, and within the bounds of good science, and they're not trying to overstep to support one side or the other.
Is this something that you've always wanted to do, like growing up, like DNA stuff, or what?
No,
what got you into it?
So I went to college. I've always been strong in biology.
Okay.
So I entered college as a biology major, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I came out. I figured I would work in a hospital lab testing specimens or something. But then I want to say my junior year, I was watching a lot of crime shows. So there's a show called Forensic Files.
Yes.
Which was really the first one.
Uh-huh.
And I watched hours and hours and hours of that. And I just decided that I wanted to be a forensic scientist. And that was what did it for me. I'm one of those people that was drawn to the field by one of these TV shows.
It seems like a lot of people had a show they liked, CSI or whatever it is, that kind of pushed them in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, it just was, if it's interesting enough for me to be interested in it, watching hours and hours and hours of it on my, sorority couch, then maybe I can handle working in that field for 30 years, 40 years, and still find it interesting every single day. And I do. I've never regretted this decision to be in forensics. It's very hard, and there's a lot of ugly, and there's a lot of stress because it's very serious work, but it's interesting every single day, every single time. And I have never regretted this decision, not a single day.
Yeah. And blood doesn't obviously gross you out, I'm assuming, but you're not dealing gallons of it, I'm thinking.
No, I've been to crime scenes where there have been gallons of blood, and certain things about going to crime scenes that I liked and that certain things I didn't like. But I didn't ever have to go and see anyone that was like significantly decomposed, or, I didn't see anything really horrific. And I'm thankful for that all the time, but I never really saw anything that scarred me so deeply. But,
so Tiffany, how do you handle the stress of your job and just, the things that you've seen and the pressures? That's got to be hard to separate. You're like your mom, your wife. How do you just compartmentalize?
No, sometimes it's not. It doesn't work out in a very clean way. Like I have a hard time getting my kids involved in extracurricular activities because I don't trust anyone. And I know that's kind of selfish, and I'm trying to work through that. My daughter is 7. I think she would love to be in gymnastics or some kind of dance. And I want to get my son, lessons in golf, but I'm just really distrustful of people.
Yeah.
So sometimes it does rear its ugly head. There's obviously medication to help with some of the stress and the depression, but there's no real good, strong answer. Sometimes I drink a glass of wine. And my husband's super supportive, but, I'm sure that there are times when I probably should speak to someone. And there are some days where like something will happen, or I'll read something that's really terrible in the news, and I will have a disproportionate reaction to it because it's realer to me than to a lot of other people. So it's not easy. I'm still a work in progress, I think, in that area. I try really hard. I've been doing it a long time. So some of the stuff you read it and you see it over and over. And then every now and again, you realize what an impact it has on you. And you maybe didn't realize that you were being affected so strongly. Yeah, it's so interesting and I love it. And there's so many positive things about it, that it outweighs the negative. And otherwise I wouldn't be able to do it.
Well, I think we won't take up too much more of your time because we definitely could keep you talking. So I think we're going to transition over into just some of our lighter-hearted questions that are just fun and silly. Nikki,
Okay.
you want to kick it off with one of your favorite?
Yeah, I always like to ask people what's something that you hoard.
Oh my gosh, something that I hoard.
You have a lot of.
When I go to a hotel and they bring me room service and they bring me those tiny bottles of Tabasco and like little tiny honeys and jam, I bring those home every time because I love meat and cheese. When I make charcuterie board, I love putting that stuff out. Everyone's so impressed with my tiny bottles.
Oh, I love it. That's a great tip for like upping your charcuterie game is to like have the little jars from the hotel. Okay, here's a tough one. What song would be the perfect theme song for your job?
Theme song for my job. So I think all the time of The Who, because it was the CSI theme song, who are you? And so I think most forensic scientists, kind of equate that song with what we do.
How did it go? You were quick draw.
Actually have a theme song. Yeah, we have a theme song in this field. It's bad.
We'll end it on this one, Tiffany. What advice would you give your 20-year-old self if she would listen?
I would just tell her to listen more and speak less. At this stage in my career, I make a living saying things that people sometimes don't want to hear. And so it's really been an attribute to me that now it kind of suits me. But sometimes, and I think definitely when you're in the beginning stages of your career, you just need to keep your mouth shut and do your work. And the less people know about you, the better. And just kind of put your head down and go, And I have a tendency to just let whatever I'm thinking come out of my mouth. So I think in my younger years, that was not my most beneficial attribute. I hadn't earned the right yet. I hadn't earned the right to do that. So you got to wait.
Well, this was so much fun, Tiffany, and we learned a lot, and we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and answer all of our random questions.
Thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to speak.
Yeah, it's awesome. Thank you. That was fun. I had no clue what DNA forensics really does, but I'm into it now. I like it.
Yeah. It's okay. It's not bad. I've never regretted it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The rest of your Friday and your weekend, and we'll talk to you.
All right. Have a good weekend.
All right. You too.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So, a lot of science, lots of levels.
Right? A lot of science.
It's not as like cut and dry.
No, I thought that you'd be able to identify someone like that and it would be used more it'd be used more like that. I thought that would be like your main, this is the person, like the main evidence.
Like a direct link.
Yeah. Like like the main evidence. I think it's interesting how it's not.
Well, I think it's really interesting how I think that it was like really thought provoking and interesting that she said you have to look at it like objectively, like even though your DNA is there, like does it make sense that it was there? Like you have, and I think it, like she said, it would be very easy to be like, well, his blood was there, so he was there and, he committed it, it would be hard to be impartial, I guess, because you do think, well, the blood was there or this was there or whatever,
Well, she's fun. She's fantastic. I like that. And I wanted to ask her about her being a lawyer. What's up with that? So she's that on top of it?
Yeah, I think so. I think she's kind of like she's mentioned in the beginning. I think she now has taken herself kind of out of the crime lab and she just works strictly in the courts. So like she said, like making sure the DNA experts are speaking correctly and speaking within the scope of the evidence. She was delightful and wonderful, and I enjoyed her company a lot. Yeah, I think the whole DNA in a whole is just fascinating.
Well, then I was thinking about when we're talking about like DNA and cloning, I'm like, is that rumor true about Walt Disney? Remember how they say he's like on ice?
Yeah. Well, by all means, let's bring him back. That I can support. All right. Well, till next time.
All right. I'll talk to you later.
All right.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We do encourage you to follow us at Instagram at Body to Burial. Hit us up on Twitter at Body to Burial. And you guessed it, you can send us an email to hello@bodytoburial.com.
If you have any guest suggestions, just let us know. Please hit the subscribe button or follow button on whatever app you are listening to.
Thanks so much, guys. See you next time.